Good morning, everybody. How are we doing? I hope you're ready for another fantastic webinar. This one's a very special one. It was flat out my idea. So if it turns out to be a bust, then you can blame me. Um, but it was, as we were kind of just, really analyzing tech support tickets and dealing with people and realized this really there's a need for this that in a traditional CAD user sense, the office that I grew up in, and your kind of typical landscape architecture office, when you start a project, it's totally acceptable to, you get your kind of base DWG file, typically from the civil or the architect, right? And you're to spend time cleaning it up, getting it prepped, getting your drawing together, and there's that chunk of time, right? And for that typical project, it's totally acceptable for that to take even a couple of hours or even half a day, really, to kind of get that project set up. Depending on the size of the project, right? Totally normal CAD workflow. But we're finding, in seeing a lot of more recent purchasers of land effects, we're getting a lot of like garden centers and landscape contractors, and a lot of their tech support tickets are very similar. Is is hey, I need to be able to just start with like this PDF or this aerial image and just go. I need to go start faster. And in talking with this one garden center, really fascinating. They were saying their designers do as many as 6 designs in a day. 6 designs in a day. I thought that was a fantastic statistic. Very honored that my software could help with that, right? And that it was the genesis for this webinar is, boy, you're right. If you are banging out 6 designs a day, you don't have time to even get a cup of coffee, right? You're going, right? So we need a faster method of starting a design for these. Typically, they're going to be smaller and residential jobs. Obviously, anything of a certain size is going to take enough time that you'll have the time to trace the line work and become actual CAD objects. But we're going to show a workflow where you don't got that time and you want to get going as fast as possible for these small little residential jobs. And now James, I'm sure, is going to just repeat a lot of that and say the same thing. I hope I didn't steal your thunder on that, James. Um, but that's basically what it is, and I'm excited about it because, like I said, it's my idea. So crucify me if it's bad. This is being recorded in all infamy, so you'll be able to reference it again and again on the website. But for right now, it is live. You're with us. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. I recommend you click that right now and get the little dialog box situated because it'll be quicker for you to type a question. We will actually answer your questions, and you'll be able to see the answers that we type to other people's questions. So it makes a really nice companion while you are on this little journey with us. So that being said, let's start this journey because, right, isn't time of the essence, James? Let's get it going.
Awesome. Good morning. Thank you for that intro. You did not steal any thunder, but you did sum everything up really well. This is my mugshot and what I do. So enough of that. Let's jump into this. Um, okay, we're gonna do a quick overview in a little bit more detail than the little summary Jared just provided. And we're gonna work through this slideshow, and then we'll hop into a demonstration. So let's talk about what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to discuss the scope and intent of this specific workflow. Um, we're going to talk about understanding the CAD interface. And if you are a seasoned CAD user, don't worry, we're not going to harp on this for too long. But for those of you who are beginners or intermediate users, there's a couple critical things that we want to go over just to make sure you have in your back pocket. And we want to discuss the relationship between model space and paper space. This is something that hangs up a lot of beginners because if you don't understand it, it can seem confusing. But honestly, once you understand all of the moving parts, it's not that complicated. It's pretty simple if you go into it with the right mindset. Um, and what we're going to spend a good portion of time today is how to import an aerial reference image. This could be from a number of sources, but the goal of today is to open CAD, hit the ground running, bring in a reference image so that you can start designing as quickly as possible. We're going to set up a sheet, and this topic here is going to be where this workflow splits off from our general CAD best practices recommendations for sheet management. So if 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 you're just trying to get going quickly and hit the ground running, this will be for you. But like Jared said, if you're working on a larger project, you're not going to need all of the information in this webinar. We'll quickly touch on how to print your sheet and some critical things to look at, things to watch out for, and things to be aware of when you're printing. And then we're going to hop into this demonstration. So when we're done with this slideshow, we're going to go through the entire process from scratch so that you can see everything in real time, essentially. We'll be going a little slower because we're teaching, but this will be a good gauge of the process for sure. All right, so let's discuss the scope and intent of this workflow. Speed, efficiency, and simplicity. Those are the three things that we're focused on. Like Jared mentioned, some designers might be working on as many as 6 designs in a day. And so they don't need all of the in-depth management of your sheets and organization and everything like that. You're just going to be focused on getting these done as rapidly as possible. This is going to be geared more towards smaller jobs, residential jobs, anything that's fast that you don't have the luxury of time on. A lot of examples could be nurseries, contractors, landscape designers, you name it. If you are a landscape contractor attached to a nursery and you're getting these jobs rolling in frequently, this workflow could prove useful for you. And we also want to talk about what this workflow is not, just to head this one off at the pass. It's not intended for larger jobs or cross-discipline jobs, and it doesn't necessarily follow our general CAD best practices. Jared touched on this in the intro. If you are a landscape architect working in a firm where your jobs are taking, weeks, months, years, or you're doing jobs that are, public or commercial scale, then you're going to need to take more time and put more thought into how you organize your projects and set everything up. But in this case, we just want to open CAD and get going right now. A quick note, if you need to search for any other additional resources, you can always go to our website, click on the videos tab, hit the search bar, type in what you need. If you were to search for sheet setup, for example, you'll find a really good webinar that goes into the theory behind how you would set your sheets up for those said larger projects. There's 2 major reasons that you would want to set your sheets up that way on a larger project. One being those projects tend to have more changes over time and you need to be able to update things. And so having everything organized correctly helps with the efficiency on that side. And another one is drawing corruption. If you're receiving a file from a landscape architect or an engineer, for example, and they did it in Civil 3D and they just exported it as a DWG for you, there's going to be a lot of extra information in that file that CAD doesn't know what to do with. They're called proxies, and if you don't clean the drawings, like Jared mentioned, this can eventually lead to drawing corruption, and it can infect other files, and it can result in a loss of work. So if you're going to be working on larger projects, where you might have a landscape plan, you might have an irrigation plan and a hardscape plan, and then you also have a base file from the architect of the building. You're going to want to make sure you spend more time investing in setting up everything properly. You will not want to follow this workflow today because you can run into the aforementioned issues. Understanding the CAD interface. We're going to just give you an overview, some basic tools. I'm going to be using a few tools today, and I'm going to do my best to talk my way through them so that I can explain exactly what I'm doing. However, if you have any questions on one of the tools we're using, don't hesitate to ask. I can definitely clarify, and our panelists can answer those questions for you as well. Some tools we'll be using today, this isn't all of them, but some of the major ones are going to be the native AutoCAD geolocation tool, the scale tool, units tool, and some others. We're also going to discuss the command line setup a bit. This is going to be extra important if you're new to CAD. We're going to discuss or show you how to change it to suit your needs. But if you're a beginner, we're going to definitely recommend that you set it up the way we recommend, and we'll explain why we want to set it up that way. And then we're going to look at layout tabs and sheets and kind of get into that, how to load a sheet from a template and get it set up to your needs. And keep in mind that this is not the full process, the time-consuming process of setting your sheets up properly. Model space versus paper space. This is one that I think is really important to understand before we get going. Model space is your working space. Most of your work is going to be done here in model space. In model space, you can think of it as being representative of the real world. So everything that you're doing, you'll want to do at a 1-to-1 scale. A simple example might be if you're putting a bench somewhere and it's a 6-foot bench, you want to make sure that bench is actually drawn at 6 feet. Paper space, it literally represents a piece of paper. You're going to set this up so that you can present your work, whether it's sharing it with a client or being able to get your design mock-ups printed out properly is important. This represents the actual sheet of paper, and on our paper space, we'll have what's called a viewport. And the viewport can be thought of as a window into model space. So it's important that we get everything done correctly in model space so that when we move on to paper space, we can set our viewport up properly. The viewport will have a viewport scale that we need to deal with. Because everything is drawn in 1-to-1 at model space, there's no way we could fit the entire project from model space on a single sheet of paper. That's where the viewport and viewport scale comes into play. We can set that up so that our plan is properly represented on the paper. And then the big takeaway, or what we're going to spend a lot of time today, is going over how to import an aerial reference image. The primary method we're going to look at, and the first thing we're going to cover, is the AutoCAD geolocation tool. But we'll also cover manually sourcing a reference image. These images can come from somewhere like Google Earth, Google Maps, or even a drone. It's worth noting that you can do this with a base file if you had received one from somebody. But with the target audience of this workflow, we're assuming that you don't have the time to go pull plans from the city, or you're not in contact with an architect. I think most of the time you're going to need to go to one of these resources, plop in an address, and then just get going. So sheet setup. Things to consider and things that we will discuss today is the size of the sheet. This one comes into play not just visually how much information you can fit onto the sheet, but also access to printers. We're assuming most people will have access to a standard printer with an 8.5 by 11 sheet size. So that's what we're going to work with today. However, there are larger sheet sizes. If you have access to a larger printer, you can go ahead and work with those. If you are trying to source a printer, it's worth noting that there are wide format printers available, but you really need to pay attention to the specifics, because some wide format printers claim to be able to print much larger, but when you look at the area that they're actually able to lay ink on paper, it's marginally larger than an 8.5 by 11. So before you invest a ton of money, make sure you do your homework on that front. When we're talking about sheet setup, we're gonna set up our viewport and play with the viewport scale to show you what you need to do in order to get your aerial reference image looking the way you want it on paper space. And we're gonna be able to do that with our viewport scale. We're gonna talk briefly about title blocks. We're not gonna get too far into the weeds, because we recommend ultimately that you, at least when you're starting out, you use one of the default templates, which will have a title block in it ready for you to go. However, you don't have to have a title block. It just looks more professional, and you can always create your own custom title block, and we have plenty of documentation and videos available for how to do that. Templates, kind of the same issue as title blocks. We are going to push you towards the defaults, especially if you're a beginner. However, if you set up a template that you like the way you want it, you can save that and load from that as a default. And there is plenty of documentation on that side of things as well. Printing is pretty straightforward if you have everything set up correctly, but there are some critical things you want to pay attention to. We're going to want to look at our print settings, things like, are you printing to a PDF or are you printing to a plotter? Do you have a CTB file selected? And we'll show you how to check your work with Print Preview before you go ahead and print it. At that point, when you're ready to print, you're going to be ready to continue on hand drawing or working on your design or mock-up in CAD. And if this workflow proves to be useful to some of you, we've thrown around the idea of doing a follow-up webinar that would basically pick up from this point and then start to get into more of the design process, design tips, and that sort of thing. So that's kind of what we're going to be looking at when we're going over printing at the end. We're pretty much ready to jump into this demonstration, but I see that there's a message in the Q&A. Do we have any questions before we hop into things?
Oh, no, we were good. Yeah, Jeffrey was just chiming in with a printer recommendation, so I'll have that ready for us later. So yeah,
Oh,
go for it.
awesome. Cool. Well, let's jump into things then. Um, Here you go. I hope you can see my screen. I have CAD open at the start screen. And the reason I have it here instead of with the drawing open is because I wanted to point out a couple of things. If I come over here and I click the new button, it would open a new drawing. But if I let my cursor hover, it'll show what template that I have set to my default. So you can see I have the Land Effects decimal feet template as my standard. If I wanted to load from a template, I can click this drop down menu and I can click on Browse Templates, and it's going to show me all of the default templates that I have here. It's important to pick one that matches the units you intend to draw in. So if you're going to be working with feet or really imperial or metric, you want to choose the appropriate template. I'm going to push you towards using the Land Effects templates as a default because we have nice title blocks and a little cheat sheet built in, which we'll go over here in a little while. But like I said before, if you want to take the time to set up your own template, you're definitely able to do so. So I'm going to go ahead and click new because mine's set to the Land Effects decimal feet template, and that's the one that I'm going to use today. And what it's going to do is it's going to open my blank drawing with a few layout tabs or sheets already in here, and they're going to be named by their size. So as you can see, I have an 8.5 by 11, an 11 by 17, and a 24 by 36. You could use whichever size you want, but today we're going to be focused on the 8.5 by 11 because that's going to be the size that pretty much everyone has access to. Okay. Another thing is down here, we have our model tab. This is going to take us to model space. And as you can see here, I have my working area where my cursor is. This is where the lion's share of your design process is going to be done in most likely. And I can always come down here to my little tabs on the bottom and I can toggle between any of my sheets that I have set up. This is where this process deviates from the other process in that we're going to do our work in this drawing and also have our sheet in this drawing. If you're doing the best practices that we recommend for larger jobs, you're going to have an individual sheet per drawing and everything is going to be separated out, but that's not what we're focused on today. Before we get into the actual process, I just want to cover a few things for those of you that are beginners, or maybe if you're intermediate and you just need a couple of pointers. If you're ever working in CAD and you want to know more about a tool, you can just hover your cursor over the tool, and initially you'll get a brief description of the tool to pop up. And if you leave your cursor there longer, you'll get a more in-depth description of the tool. If you ever need additional information beyond that, a video on how to do it or something like that, you can press F1 and it's going to take you to additional information regarding that tool. So if you're new, don't be too intimidated. You can literally get a tutorial for every tool that is there. Besides that, we have our command line here at the bottom, and the command line is completely critical to all things CAD. So it's important that you have your command line set up in a way that is gonna make your process and your workflow more efficient. If you look at the corner here, I have these dots. I can click and grab, and it allows me to undock and move around my command line. So you can have some freedom in that sense. But I recommend, especially for beginners, you leave it docked down here at the bottom to take the full screen. So it goes the whole width of your model space, and it's down at the bottom out of the way. Additionally, another recommendation for the command line is you can see that if I hover my cursor over, the cursor changes to this little stretch symbol. I can adjust the height of my command line, and you can see that there's further information shown here. So as you do things in CAD, the command line will scroll up. This text will just keep scrolling. So we want to recommend that you keep at least 3 to 4 lines visible here. You don't have to get crazy, but you want to have a little bit of history just at a glance of what the system is doing. This can be invaluable at times if you're getting errors or something's not going the way you expected it to. And you can get a lot of information and a lot of clues as to what's going on by referring to your command line. Additionally, if you have some bizarre issue and you're going to reach out to tech support, in addition to sending over the files and the information that tech support will need, it can be useful to sometimes, screenshot or copy and paste an error message from the command line so that tech support can be armed with the information they need to help you. Um, when it comes to modifying or customizing your interface in general or the command line, you can click the little wrench icon here, and you're going to have some options. Immediately, you have input settings. I'm going to recommend that you leave them at default until you are really familiar with how it works. And then you can also even click the options button, and this is going to bring up your options tab, and you can see here that we're on the display tab by default. This is going to allow you to customize a lot of aspects of your user interface in general. And I definitely recommend leaving them at default until you're more familiar with things. You want to understand the nature of the beast before you start trying to tame it. So we're not going to play with that. um, Last thing I want to say about the command line, this is going to be obvious to any of my seasoned users out there, but if you're new, you don't have to click with your cursor down here to begin typing. You can have your cursor anywhere you want in model space, and you can just start typing. And as you can see down there, it's going to pull up whatever it finds that's relevant to what I've typed. Another thing that we can do is when you begin typing a command, it's going to sort the commands by the most similar to what you're typing. For example, we can get into things now. If I wanted to open my geolocation tool, all I have to do is start typing. I can say geo, and you'll see that it's going to give you all of the suggestions that are related to what you're typing. So if you type geo, it's going to rank them by the most likely tool that you're looking for. And so you can see that the geolocation tool is right there at the top. You could click on it, but if you're just looking for speed, you could just type geo and hit enter. And what this is going to do now is it's going to prompt us for the next step of the tool. So most tools have multiple steps in order to complete the function. And when you're working with any tool, you always want to refer to the command line because it's going to give you those prompts of what you need to do next. So in this case, at the end of the line there, you can see that in brackets, we have two options. We have map and file, and the first letter of each one of those is highlighted in blue. If you ever see that in any tool, that's indicating to you that you have options to choose from at that point in the tool. For our purposes on using this geographic location tool, we want to use the map, and you can see at the end of the line there, it's already set to map. So we could just hit enter if we wanted and continue with map, but let's say it was on file right now. All you have to do is type the blue letter that it's showing you and then press enter, and it's going to know you specified that option. So we can type M for map and hit enter, and that's going to tell the system that we wanted that option. This will pop up, especially the first time you use the geolocation tool. It's going to ask you if you want to use online map data. We're just going to go ahead and say yes. And what it's going to do now is it's going to open the geolocation dialog box, and it's going to allow us to start progressing through the tool. As you can see here, I have my map. It's a lot like Google Earth or Google Maps. I have my scale here at the bottom, which is really handy. What I really like and appreciate about the AutoCAD tool is that it gives you both the imperial measurement of scale and the metric. So I have miles and kilometers here. That's going to be very important later on when we're sourcing an aerial image manually. We're going to really need to pay attention to that. So if you're using something like Google Earth or Google Maps, you're going to need to make sure that you get the correct reference here. I noticed that when I was playing with all these things, Google Earth was set to metric by default, and I had to go into my settings to change it to imperial. So just pay attention to that on any type of imagery that you're going to need to be scaling. You want to make sure that you have a way to accurately scale it. If you're using a drone or something, and you don't have that luxury of having the scale there, you can scale the drawing based off of a known object. So if you knew that the sidewalk was a specific distance, you could scale your drawing off of that. And obviously, the more precise you can be, the more accurate this is going to be. Um, so at the end of the day, we want to get it as close as possible to actual scale so that our design can be the most accurate as possible. Now, when we want to begin looking around and playing with this map, you'll see here at the top, I have different layers that I can choose from. So I could get a road map that would look something like a GPS. We can do an aerial or a bird's eye view. I'm going to go ahead and leave this one on aerial because it's the most applicable to our needs today. You can zoom with these plus and minus buttons or your mouse wheel. And I can also click and hold in order to pan. So I can move all around if I want to with my mouse. And as you'll notice, if I zoom in more, uh, the scale here will automatically update to be, the most appropriate for how zoomed in you are. So you can pan around and use this map manually to find your location, or you can also type in an address here, just like you would in a GPS, and it would take you right to that address. Um, Something that was cool that I didn't know is you can type in a partial address and it'll get you as close as it can. I'm assuming most people that are gonna come to you for a landscape design of any kind, they're gonna give you their actual address, so you're not gonna necessarily need to manually hunt around. But just for the sake of showing this tool off, let's go ahead and just type in a partial address to see how it works. In my preparation for this, I was snooping on some of the fancy areas in Santa Barbara, California, because there's some really insanely pretty homes out that way. So one street that I wanted to look at is called Bel Air, and it's in Santa Barbara. So if I don't have a specific street address, I can just type in Bel Air, Santa Barbara, and it's going to go ahead and get me as close as it can. Um, you'll see here, this is giving me the option to drop a marker, but because I did not type a specific address, I don't want to drop a marker here. So I'm just going to go ahead and minimize this for now. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. So you can see that it took me to this highway, and it's not exactly the road that I chose, but it's pretty close. I know that the road that I was looking at is right here. This is Bel Air Drive. Um, so let's say, you found a house that you wanted to work with, or you found the house that you are working with, and you want to zoom in as much as you can in order to still encompass the full site. If we're going to use this house as an example, you can see I'm zoomed in to max, and my scale here is now at 25 feet and 10 meters. It's no longer in miles and kilometers, which is good. That's what we want. And now we can see the whole aerial image here. If I want to, I can bring this guy back and see that this marker was still based on my search. So I don't want to now click drop a marker here. What I want to do instead is I want to right click where I want to place the marker. So I'm going to go ahead and place this one right in the middle of the house here. And I have this option to drop marker here. Now, this marker is not absolutely necessary, but it's going to help us with a couple of things. As you can see here, it's marked our latitude and longitude. And what this is going to allow us to do is when we bring this data in, it's going to allow into CAD, it's going to allow us to specify where we want this marker to be. So we can use this marker as our origin, if you will. So once you found your site and you've put a marker on it, you can go ahead and you can click next. Now, what this is going to do, and this was intimidating to me the first time I saw it, I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much going on. What is this? It's just asking you to specify a coordinate system. And if you look here on the left, these are sorted by order of how close they are to the marker that you dropped. So all you need to do is choose the closest one that you have that matches the units that you're going to be working in. So this one's in feet, and I'm going to be working in imperial units today. So I'm going to go ahead and just specify this one. And at the bottom here, you can see I can specify my time zone. This one already pulled in the correct time zone for me. And down here, I have drawing units. You don't want to necessarily change that here, but you just want to make sure that it's going to match the units that you intend to work in. So this one looks good. I've got feet here, I've got the correct time zone, and I have the closest coordinate system that's in the units I want. So from here, all I have to do is click next. And what it's going to do is, if you look at the bottom of the command line there, it's going to ask me to specify a location for the origin. So because we placed that marker in the center of the house, we'll go ahead and we'll hit enter. And what that's going to do is it's going to put that marker right at 000. Now you would have the option if you wanted to specify a different coordinate, but why make things harder than they need to be? So go ahead and hit enter. And next thing it's going to do is it's going to ask me to specify my direction of north. This seems silly, but there might be some use cases, I suppose, that I haven't wrapped my head around where you'd want to specify something different. But just like most things, we're going to just leave north as pointing up. So we can just go ahead and hit enter again. And now it's going to bring this map data into our model space with those settings that we specified. And as you can see here, it's now turned our entire model space into the map. And we don't need all of that extra information. So what I can do is I can zoom in here to where my marker is. And you can see that red dot represents the marker we placed, and it's in the correct location. Now we can move forward with getting rid of some of this extra map data here. But before we do that, let's take a look at these tools that we have. As you can see here, we can click this drop down menu for the map aerial. You could still change the map layer that you're on. We're going to go ahead and leave ours at aerial. You could mark a position. So you could specify a certain coordinate, or you could just add a point. And if you add a point, it's going to allow you to label that point. So I could say, something like a driveway existing, just as an example. So you can go ahead and make any little call outs that you want. You can reorient your marker if you decided that you didn't have it in the correct spot. And you could even edit the location. If you click edit location from map, all it's going to do is bring the dialog box back up for us, and we can rework it as we see fit. So once we have everything set up the way that we want it, it's time for us to capture an area of this map so that we can isolate it. The way we'll do that is with the capture area tool here. If you drop down, you have two options. You have capture area and you have capture viewport. Capture viewport is a little more complex, so we're just going to go with capture area. It's a faster, more simple way to do this. And if I look at my map down there, it's going to ask me to specify the corners of the area that I want to capture. So this is going to be the same process as if you were to draw a rectangle with the rectangle tool. You're going to click one point, drag, and click a second point. What we want to do when we're looking at the site is we want to capture an area that encompasses the full site and maybe a little bit beyond so that we have some context. In this case, we're going to take this whole property here. So I can estimate where I want this to be based on my cursor. So I'm going to go ahead and click somewhere about here and bring it down over here, maybe something like that. And what that's going to do is now create an image of this zone. So as you can see, I still have my entire map here, but now I have this isolated area. If I select this isolated area, I have further control over the portion within. But before we move on to that, if you want to get rid of the entire map, you can go ahead and you can remove the map data. So if I wanted to, I could click on the image here and I could begin playing with this. And if I wanted to remove the map data, I could. One thing I want to note is before you remove the map data, you should click on your image, on your area that you've specified, because while you still have the map data in, you can adjust some of these settings that will not be available to you after you remove the map data. Primarily this optimal button here is going to give you control over how precise or how basically how high definition your drawing is. So we're going to take this off of optimal and we're going to put it on very fine. It's a pretty subtle difference. It makes more of a difference when you're zoomed in and you can see the pixels more, but like if I were to drop it down to coarse, for example, you could see that subtle shift. So we want to make sure that we have that set to fine. Now, if I am ready to remove this and I have my image set up the way that I want, I can go ahead and I can remove location, and it's going to ask you to confirm that you want to do that. And what it's going to do is it's going to pull out all of that geodata associated with it. So it's going to get rid of the map, it's going to get rid of your marker, and it's going to leave you with just an image of the area that you've selected. So now we don't have all of that extra information in model space. If I want to make any edits to this image at this point, I can go ahead and I can select it, and I can adjust certain settings. Let me see. Okay. If I click on my border here, it'll take me back to my image properties. I can still adjust things like my brightness and contrast, and most importantly, I can adjust my fade. So this is going to adjust the transparency of my aerial image. This will be a personal preference thing that you'll have to play with as you go and work on your work on your process. But I'm going to recommend that you have some level of opacity here so that when you're making your marks or your design, whether it's by hand or in CAD, the design elements that you're placing on this are going to really pop. They're not going to be drowned out by the background noise of the reference image itself. So that looks pretty good. I can just go ahead and click enter, and now I have that slight level of transparency set to this drawing. Another thing that's worth noting, I kind of overlooked this because I just loaded from a template, is before you start actually drawing anything in CAD, you're going to want to make sure you set your units. And so you can type units and hit enter. And in my case, they're already set to decimal feet because I loaded my template. So I'm just here to confirm. But if you hadn't started from a template, you might want to double check that. It's not going to create an issue at this point because we haven't actually drawn anything, but just a good note to always set your units before you begin designing. So now what we've done is we've pulled in this geo image from the geolocation tool, and we have it set up in model space. What we can do now is we can hop on over to our paper space and we can begin setting that up. So what I'm going to do, like I said, I'm going to come over here to my 8.5 by 11, and we're going to take a quick look at what we have going on here. So this white area is actually representative of the piece of paper. So that's going to be 8.5 by 11. What we also have is a title block. This is the default one that came with my template. And off to the side here, we have a cheat sheet. So it's really important to reference this cheat sheet because it's going to walk you through everything you'll need to do to set up your title block. But it also kind of highlights some of those things we discussed in the beginning about the relationship between paper space and model space. So, you know, it's going to recommend that you draw everything at full scale in model space. It's going to allow you or tell you you can adjust your viewport. So this green box here is my viewport. Let me deselect so it's the only thing selected. This is my viewport. I can use these grips to change the size of my viewport relative to my sheet. Number 3 is going to be use the plot scale to adjust your viewport scale. So before we do that though, I just want to point out a couple of other things. First of all, if you have information off to the side in this gray area, like the cheat sheet is, you don't have to worry. That's not going to be printed. It's only going to print what's on your sheet. And we need to understand a little bit more before we begin scaling things on how this viewport works. So if I'm how I am now, I'm not in the viewport. I haven't double clicked into my viewport to enter the viewport. I'm working in model space, or I'm sorry, I'm working in paper space. So if I were to do something like draw a line here, I would be able to select it because it's on paper space. I drew this on paper. If I went into model space by activating my viewport, so if I double click inside, you'll see now that the border has been highlighted green. That's an indication to you, a visual indication that you're inside the viewport now. So now you're effectively working in model space through the window of your viewport. So if I were to go ahead and draw a line here, you know, I could select it because I'm still model space, but if I were to now click out again, back to paper space, I'm not going to be able to interact with that line because I drew it in model space. The takeaway here is really pay attention when you're working with paper space to the status of your viewport. I've done this plenty of times where I was doing something inside the viewport, not paying attention, and then accidentally zoomed or changed something because I wasn't in the space that I thought I was in. Okay, so now if I am still in my viewport, I can zoom in and out. So I can zoom way out and make our entire image fit in the viewport, or I could zoom way in and only show part of it. But you need to be aware that just by zooming doesn't necessarily mean that you're at the scale you want to be at. So the way we can set our scale is really simple. When you have it, how I have it right now, where you're actively in the viewport, you can come up and you can hit your scale tool, and it's going to ask you to specify a scale. So 1 inch to 20 feet is a common working scale. What that is saying is 1 inch on your piece of paper is equivalent to 20 feet in the real world. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll click OK, and we can set it active. Yes, it's going to ask us if we want to set the viewport to be active. We'll say yeah. And what that's going to do is it's going to adjust the scale for us. So if we wanted to go ahead and play with some different scales, we could do, see what 1 to 40 feet looks like, and say yes. And it's going to, make it smaller because now 1 inch is representing 40 feet. We can do a smaller one, 1 to 10 feet maybe. And this is where you'll have the option to play with and get the scale set up according to your needs. So for example, 1 to 10 is pretty tight, especially on an 8.5 by 11 sheet. If you were only working on the front yard, you might be able to pan over and leave it at 1 to 10. But if you wanted to grab the whole site, for example, and fit it onto one sheet, maybe 1 to 20 would be more appropriate. So we can go ahead and go back to 1 to 20, and I can pan to where I have, the sheet, the image where I want it. Now, at this point, if you have your scale set and everything the way you want it, if you come down here to the bottom right-hand corner, there's this button right here that looks like a lock. You can go ahead and you can click that, and it'll highlight in blue, and it's active. And what that'll do is it'll prevent you from zooming in and out of model space when you're active in the viewport. So as you can see, the difference here is now that I'm zooming, even though I'm in my viewport, you can tell because it's highlighted, it's zooming me in and out of my paper space, not my model space. So if you've played with your scale and you've got that set to your liking, go ahead and lock it, and it can help you accidentally prevent messing up your scale. Now, it's no big deal if this wasn't locked and you bumped your mouse wheel, you're like, oh, I messed it up. You can just come back up to your scale tool and reset it like that. And then, you might have to pan to get it fitting the way you want it. So then you can go ahead and click lock. So at this point, we would be ready to move forward. We could start filling out our title block as we see fit. But before we move forward in that sense, let's say I wanted to do a front yard and a backyard. It's really easy. I could duplicate this sheet here, or I could use this plus button to create a new one. Or I can even right click on the new plus button and I can select to open a new one from a template. So if I wanted another 8.5 by 11 to match, I could do it that way. And likewise, if you've created and taken the time to set up your own specific or custom template, you can go ahead and save them, and they'll be available in here as well. So you would see your templates in this list as well. And there's plenty of documentation on how to set up your templates. But for today, since we're focused really on speed and efficiency and getting through this as fast as possible, we're going to recommend that you just run with one of the Land Effects defaults because it has everything you need, including this cheat sheet to walk you through it. So now this would be ready. We have our reference image, and you can see now how the transparency might come into play. So if I wanted to increase my fade and lighten up that background image, that would show on my paper space. And again, the reason you want to work in model space is because if you're making changes to anything, when you pop back over here to paper space, this is just a window into model space. So it's going to be looking at whatever is actively happening in model space. What you don't want to do and what you want to avoid, you don't want to basically build the bad habit of clicking into your viewport and working in model space this way. It's just going to be prone to more issues. It's less efficient. So you always want to make sure that you're doing your work directly in model space. And then when you're setting up your sheets, you're just using the viewport to display the information that you're looking for. Um, that pretty much covers the AutoCAD geolocation tool. Before we hop on over to how to manually source and size reference images, do we have any questions kind of regarding the geolocation tool or Paperspace or anything like that?
Nope. Nothing on that. I think you covered that well. I thought that was fantastic. And then but it was interestingly said that we had a great recommendation on an 11 by 17 printer, and I was blown away. Wow, it could do a full bleed 11 by 17 print. I'm like, that's impressive. So, anyway,
Yeah,
gonna add that to the hardware recommendations webinar. But
awesome.
all right, we'll keep on moving.
Okay. So now let's assume that you want to go through this process, but you're not going to be using the AutoCAD geolocation tool. Um, the process is very much the same, but there's a few extra steps that we need to take in order to set this equivalent image up. So I'll go ahead and I will delete this image just so we have an empty model space, and I'll delete this little note we made. And for a moment here, I'm going to go ahead and get out of CAD. And I'm going to pop over here to my internet. While I'm here, I have two examples set up, Google Maps and Google Earth. These are two really great resources to get aerial imagery. There's a couple of things we want to pay attention to before we just start grabbing things at will. And it's worth noting that this process is also going to apply to some, the process is going to apply to other types of imagery as well, whether it's from a drone or somebody sent you a file to work with. So these steps that we're going to cover will still apply. A couple of things about Google Earth and Google Maps is it might be worth checking both of them. For example, if I just kind of zoom in here and find a house as a reference, um, you want to consider the clarity and the quality of the image. So if you were going to be comparing two houses, you could bounce back and forth between Google Maps and Google Earth to see which one you like better. Um, on Google Earth in particular, you really want to be careful of this tilt feature. So if you're panning around looking at a site, you want to really make sure that before you take your screenshot, that you reset everything in terms of tilt. You want to minimize your tilt, and then you also want to reset to north so that it would be oriented properly. You can imagine how if you had something slightly skewed and you took a screenshot, then it's going to do weird things with your scale later on and your placement of your design. So in Google Earth in particular, pay attention to that. And on both Google Earth and on Google Maps, you want to make sure that it's set to the correct settings. So I did notice that on Google Earth in particular, it was defaulted to meters. So if you wanted to, you can come up to the Tools tab, go to Settings, and you could switch your units of measurement to feet and miles or meters and kilometers. So um, this will make a little more sense when we get our screenshot and we bring it into CAD, but you want to make sure that you have the appropriate units to match the units you're working in so that you can scale your image properly. Google Maps is worth noting too. You can see down here, Google Maps on the bottom right-hand corner is set to feet. So that's why I'm highlighting this, is because in my own testing, I was like, hey, didn't notice that right away. That is a difference. But again, much like the AutoCAD geolocation tool, you can change your layers here and you can get the different types of layers that you want, and you might experiment with some of those. We'll just go ahead and leave it on satellite because it's pretty comparable. So what you'll want to do is when you have your site kind of oriented the way that you would like it, you could go ahead and take a screenshot. If you're going to take a screenshot of it, I highly recommend, you grab the scale here so that when we bring it into CAD, it's easy to scale. So let's say you've taken your screenshot, and I have one on my desktop here as an example. If I preview it, you can see that I took the full site. I had plenty of room here to cover my entire site, and I caught the 20 feet scale in the bottom. That's going to be really useful for us to accurately scale this in a moment. So assuming you've opened CAD, you've set your units and you've set everything up to your liking. Now you have your screenshot as well. You can drag and drop the screenshot, and what it's going to add, drag and drop into model space to be specific. It's going to ask you if you want a drop shadow or a caption. We're going to uncheck both of those because we don't need them. We just want this to be just the image coming in, and we can click OK. And if we refer to our command line in the bottom, it's going to ask us to specify a point. And then it's going to ask us to scale it. So I can just click anywhere I want, and as I drag my mouse, it's going to increase the scale of the image. So if I set this, I don't know, just something arbitrary like that, now we have our image. But it's worth noting that it's off in space. It's not placed at 0, 0, and we haven't scaled it properly. So let's take a look at how we might go about scaling this. So we know that this this scale represents 20 feet. So what I can do is I can use my align command to scale this properly. And the way that I like to do this is I'm going to trace this with a line, a polyline. So I can type PL and hit enter. And I can click at the first point here on this end. And you can see it's asking me to specify the second point of the line, and I have ortho mode on. I'm going to leave ortho mode on so that I know I'm aligned with the scale here, and I'm just going to go ahead and click to place my second point. So it's in black, but it's there. So now we have a line that is, relatively close to 20 feet, close enough for what we're going to be doing. Well, it's not actually close to 20 feet. It's representing the size of this scale bar here. So now what we'll do is we'll draw an additional line below this, and we'll draw this one specifically at 20 feet. So I can hit 20 and hit enter. So you can see that in model space, that's actually 20 feet. And you can see that our screenshot is not properly scaled. So in order to scale this, what we can do is we can select the image and the line we drew, and we can type align to open our align command. Once it pops up, we can hit enter.
Oh, you don't want
And
to do, you don't want to use our scale by reference command? It's so fancy.
oh, that's another way we could do it also.
Yeah, I'm just gonna show a line first. I think because it helps to show how cool ours is if you show the align command first.
Okay.
I'll shut up. Go ahead.
So now that I've aligned command, it's going to ask me to pick at least 2 source points. So it's going to ask me to specify the first one. I can go ahead and turn my snaps on, and by turning my snaps on, it's going to grab exactly the end of that line, and then it's going to ask me to do my my reference point, which I'll click there, and then I'll do the same for this one and this one. And then it's prompting me for a third point, but I only need 2 for this case, so I'm just going to hit enter to continue. And again, here we go with our little blue letters indicating we have options. It's going to ask us if, while we align the image, if we want to do scale it or not. So I'm going to type yes because I do want it to scale. And by doing that, it's going to align everything properly. So I can go ahead and delete these reference lines now. And now we have our image actually properly scaled. And if we wanted to confirm that, we can use our distance tool, just typing DI. And, we can click about here and here. And if this is close to 20, here we are. We're pretty much on the mark, with the exception of me misclicking a little bit. So now we have a scaled image, much like we did before. If we want, we can go ahead and move this to orient it to 0, 0. So if we said we want this point, I can hit M for move, press enter, select the objects. I'll select the image, press enter, specify my displacement point. So I'll just click this spot, and then it's gonna ask me to click where I want it to go or type a coordinate. I'll just type 0, 0 and hit enter. Now we have our image centered around our origin the way we did the other one, and we have it properly scaled. You can also adjust the fade just like we did with our other image, and dial that in the way you want it. And now we're ready to set up our sheet for this image just like we would. As you can see, this image is slightly different than the last one. So I know that I have my same scale set on this viewport, and my viewport is locked, so I'm not going to accidentally zoom and ruin my scale. So I can double click in here, and I could pan around all I wanted and adjust that to my liking. So the process is very similar whether you're using the geolocation tool or you're using a manual tool, there's just, or if you're manually sourcing your image, you just need to make sure that if you're going to manually source your image, that you do those extra steps of properly um, scaling it. Okay, Jared, did we want to show off the other tool?
Yeah, if we could, that'd be great.
Okay, so should I, and this wasn't planned, should I back this up so it's not scaled?
Correct. Yeah, yeah. Just back it up. No need to like use a different image. I don't think. I think you could just use the
I'm just
same
gonna
image.
manually scale this so we know it's off. All right, now you want to walk us through this real quick?
Oh my gosh. Okay, on the spot. Yeah. What is it? It's in General Tools, isn't it? Now I'm trying to think where it is.
I was just using a line, so I didn't play with this beforehand.
I know. I think it's right in General Tools, right above
Uh,
you, right there. Uh, Scale by reference. Yeah.
okay. It's
Boom,
gonna ask us
boom.
to select the object,
And
select
now
the first
just
point,
yep. So now click your 2 points on your scale reference there.
first point, and second point. Reference length was 17 feet. We can change this to 20 feet.
Boom.
Object has been scaled,
So it's
and
yeah,
now
just
we can
walks you
confirm.
through it a little better, and a little cleaner. Has the dialog box to really make it clear. Is all. So just going for clarity and minimum number of prompts, and because that was one of the first week people were like, oh, it's such a pain scaling a PDF, which it is, and so it's too many clicks. See, so just so it's definitely fewer clicks, but the align command, of course, has you know is just a core AutoCAD command that people can find all kinds of YouTube references and everything on how to use. And this one's only a land effects tool, so it's use what you feel works for you. That's what I would say.
Yeah, it's definitely faster. And if I were to highlight over the tool here and let it show, you can see it gives me a pretty nice description of how to do it. So if you were going to walk through that the first time and you didn't really know how to do it, just check it here and then follow your command line. The command line's a really good guide. It's most of the time very clear what it wants you to do. There are some occasions where if you don't understand the tool or what the tool is trying to do, the command line prompt might be a bit confusing, in which case you might want to check some of the additional resources, maybe find a video of somebody using the tool. But for the most part, everything is right there for you to follow along. Really quickly, with the last few minutes, let's talk about some printing things and some things to look for when you print. We're going to go ahead and keep this simple and not get bogged down in the weeds because we could probably spend a whole hour talking about print settings, but that would be a bit dry. So I'm just going to walk you through some of the critical things to consider. You can click the plot tool or you could type print, doesn't matter. And it's going to open up your plot dialog box here. The first thing that you want to pay attention to is this drop down menu where you can specify your plotter. So if you wanted to print to a specific printer, you could choose that. But for this case, I'm just going to leave it at print to PDF. You'll want to confirm that your paper size is indeed matching the paper that you're intending to print. You'll want to check this drop-down menu. By default, I can't recommend enough leaving this at LFX CTB, or maybe experiment with some of these lighter ones if you want. What the CTB file is essentially doing is it's telling the system how heavy to print a line. Basically, it assigns the line weight based on the layer that the line lives on. So in this case, we have our title block here, and it's got multiple lines on different layers. So you can see some of the lines are blue, some of them are this pinkish color. Based on your CTB, the system is going to assign a line weight to those based on their layer. So um, we'll show that really quick in a minute, but the last few things that you'll want to pay attention to on your plotting options are assuming you're using our defaults. This is a landscape, not a portrait layout. You'll want to make sure that you have that selected and matching. And then you can have these other options here that you might want to play with. For example, plot transparency is really nice to have because if you have layers that have a transparency setting, it's going to actually print the lines a little bit lighter for you. But you can probably get away with just leaving these at default. So if I go ahead and click preview, I can go ahead and get an example of my sheet. before I actually print it. So I know this is what it's going to look like. And as you can see, the line weights here, based on that CTB, have printed at the correct um, line weights because we were using the LandFX default template, which brought the title block in based on LandFX defaults. And then we used the LandFX default CTB, and it's plotting nice and clean looking. Just to kind of show you the difference a CTB can make, if I were to go down and do the 25% and do another preview, you can see that the line work here is going to be a lot lighter. So you do have some wiggle room there. And if you really wanted to get lost in the weeds and set up your own CTBs, which I don't recommend, you could, but that's a time-consuming rabbit hole to go down. Can't recommend enough just running with the LandFX defaults because we put in all the time and effort to make things nice and clean for you so you didn't have to deal with it. But I do understand that sometimes you are working in an office that has its own standards or working for a company with its own standards, and hopefully they've gone through the trouble to set up their own CTB and you can use it. But moral of the story is any CTB files that you have created or saved should show up in this list. So when you go to print, just make sure you have that selected. Um, and you can also get all of your settings dialed in just the way you like them, and you can click apply to layout. And then every time you open the plot dialog box again, you're not going to have to change or mess with anything. It's going to remember those settings. Um, that's just about time. Do we have any other questions that have come up?
I mean, that was pretty much it. We had a couple good comments. Like I said, we had a great suggestion for a printer, and then also we had a good comment about some states have really high quality aerial imagery that's free to use. So finding those sorts of resources is really helpful. But yeah, I think at this point we have come to the end of another fantastic Land Effects webinar. Obviously we could continue this sort of theme with, how do you set up your templates and your projects so that you can, complete these sorts of jobs very, very quickly. So that's a whole subject area we could get into. We really like getting webinar ideas from you guys. So if you have any suggestions, please, you're always welcome to send us subject matters that you'd love to see covered in a webinar. But beyond that, everyone have a fantastic weekend, and we will catch you next time.